Welcome to the Watchdog with Lowkey. As you know, here at Mint Press, we are engaging in searing investigative journalism which goes against the grain, which covers stories the mainstream media generally ignore. For that reason, we need your support. So please watch, share this video, like it, comment, and also support us on Patreon. This week, we are joined by the head reporter for Declassified, investigative journalist who has worked for Corporate Watch, Reprieve, and other... let me rewind that, sorry. This week, we are joined by chief reporter from Declassified, who investigate... sorry, man.
Right.
Okay. This week, we are joined by chief reporter for Declassified, Phil Miller. Phil, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Lowkey, for having me on the show.
It's great to be joined by you. I also understand that you were quoted by Akala in his book Natives. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, he cited an article I'd written about, this was about British Army advice, I think for a mining company in South Africa. So he picked up on that article and mentioned it in his book, which is great.
Great stuff. Now, you have just released with Declassified the film Wharton's War on Yemen. What does this area in the heart of Lancashire have to do with Yemen?
Yeah, so this village, Wharton, I say it's a village, but it has its own runway, which a 737 plane can take off on, and it has its own arms factory. And this is where they made the planes that were sold to Saudi Arabia a number of years ago, and it's where the company BAE Systems keep maintaining those aircraft. So fighter jets require constant maintenance almost every time they go out on a mission, and so there's a whole number of spare parts and other updates that are done at the Wharton factory, and then each week they're flown out to Saudi Arabia to keep the Saudi jets in the sky and bombing Yemen.
And in terms of building the film, it's also based around the testimony of a former lawyer for the Foreign Office, Molly Mulready. Now, that's a brilliant source to get a hold of. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, we'd seen that Molly had written a piece, I think, in The Independent when she first kind of blew the whistle about what she'd seen in the Foreign Office. And we'd been in contact with her since then. And while we were making the film, we'd gone up to Wharton and done some vox pops there, but we felt, it'd be good to interview someone who really knew more about the Foreign Office side of things. And so we were lucky enough to record the interview with her and put those two, they're almost two separate films, but actually when we put them together, it seemed to work really well. So, it just came together nicely.
What do you think is the key to getting more people within the sort of nuts and bolts and machinery of the war machine to come out and speak about their experiences within it, like Molly Mulready?
Yeah, we've seen, there is a small number of whistleblowers now from the war in Yemen. Another one is Ahmed al-Batati, who you interviewed recently, a former British soldier, who went on strike effectively over the arms sales because the British military is heavily involved in the arms sales to Saudi Arabia. He was born in Yemen, so he had a bit of a personal perspective on it. And morally, he thought it was wrong. And also he'd been reading things, including on Declassified, about how heavily Britain was involved in the war. So, that's something Molly, obviously, because she was working as a lawyer in the Foreign Office, knew directly how much Britain was involved. But I think there is a role for journalists there in kind of exposing and explaining what Britain is doing in the world. And then people who are involved in those systems can make their own judgments. But yeah, there's also a former defense attaché who served in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Brigadier John Deverell, I think is his name, and he's come out quite critically about the war. but it is astonishing that there aren't more people coming out, given how horrendous it is. I think the workers at BAE Systems, they have kind of clauses in their contracts and to do with their pensions as well that would mean they could be in jeopardy of losing those if they spoke out. So I think, they try and put financial and legal pressure on people not to come out against the war.
It's also one of your pieces that revealed that it was £17.6 billion worth of military hardware that BAE Systems have sold to the Saudi military since it began bombing Yemen. We've also seen pushback from the campaign against the arms trade through the court system, where they have been successful to some extent. But then not long after that, the British government were able to structure not a very convincing argument, but some kind of argument that actually these examples where whether it was hospitals or whether it was the sanitation system or a funeral hall had been bombed by the Saudi government, that these didn't represent a pattern of behavior, quote unquote. And so therefore sales to Saudi Arabia would not be seen to violate Britain's responsibility under the Arms Trade Treaty to assess whether these sales may be used for violations of international humanitarian law. So we see within the government, there's these sort of mechanisms of justification. But what I thought was brilliant about the film is that you have several different layers of cognitive dissonance at work here. So when Matt Kennard approaches the gentleman working as security at the Wharton base, he says clearly to Matt, we know who you are and you won't find many people who want to speak to you about this. You then also see Matt go to what I understand to be the town centre and speak to some people about what is happening in the area they live in and the relationship to Saudi Arabia. And a lot of people are not aware of it. But then also you sort of juxtapose that with Molly Mulready, who is brought to tears at certain points because of this sort of level of complicity in this extraordinary level of human suffering. Specifically on this issue, why do you think the sort of manufacturing of ignorance is so successful when it comes to British policy towards Yemen?
Yeah, I think if there wasn't that ignorance and people knew, just how regularly innocent people were being blown up by British bombs, then it would become unconscionable, and it would have to stop, and that would cost BAE a lot of money, unless the government diversified them into socially useful manufacturing. So, there are a lot of vested interests. The chairman of BAE is earning about 700,000 a year for a part-time role. The CEO, I think, gets even more than that. So, there's a huge amount of money at stake there. And these companies, every time you go into Westminster Tube Station, BAE have an enormous advert above the escalators. So they're completely plugged into Westminster and into our government. So, there's a lot of vested interest there in making sure there is ignorance. And, the fact that Molly, I think we were the first journalists to interview her on camera. I still find that extraordinary. Why have the BBC not interviewed her? Why have Channel 4 News not interviewed her? She's such an important whistleblower. And yet it's as if she doesn't exist at all. And, she knows that they've done that deliberately. Ignoring her is the best way of making her story go away. It's like with Ahmed al-Batati, they didn't press charges against him. They just let him out, let him leave the army. If that had gone to court, then it could have become more of a kind of media issue. So yeah, I think the state is very kind of sophisticated in how it deals with these whistleblowers, and it knows it can rely on a very pliant media that isn't going to follow up these stories.
I mean, as you also mentioned, and a recording is shown of him at an AGM in the film Roger Carr. I understand it to be an AGM. I might be incorrect. Yeah, Roger Carr, in which he's talking about, he's basically putting forth an argument for BAE Systems, which says that the more you arm people, the quicker you end wars, because the wars become more asymmetrical, essentially. Now, Roger Carr, as you pointed out, earns almost £1 million a year in his role at BAE Systems, but previously he was on the board of the BBC Trust, which was at that time the body which regulated the BBC. So a very clear conflict of interest. How much more can you sort of tell us about this relationship between whether it's BAE Systems and the media, or BAE Systems and the existing British establishment? Another perfect example would, of course, be Prince Charles and Prince Andrew, I imagine.
Yeah, so the royal family are also effectively lobbyists for BAE Systems, and they go on these tours of the Middle East, of the Gulf regimes, and they are there to help sell weapons. Effectively, they're often sent at quite sensitive times when maybe, for instance, there was a bit of pushback in the UK about some of the bribery on the Saudi arms deals, and the Serious Fraud Office started investigating, and that was seen to jeopardize future contracts. So, the roles were dispatched to Saudi then to try and patch up relations and ensure that those arms sales would continue to go ahead. So they play a very high level role in this entire relationship, and particularly Prince Andrew. So I think that's a key element to understanding it. And we did look at the number of visits. I can't remember off the top of my head, but since the Arab Spring in particular, to the Gulf regimes and countries like Morocco as well, which all have absolute or monarchies that effectively control the state. So yeah, I mean, this is well known really, but it's often kind of glossed over, or people look the other way, and a lot of the reporting on these royal visits doesn't get to the core of why they're actually going to these countries.
I mean, you also picked out specifically Prince Andrew not being stopped in his proselytizing mission for BAE Systems, even by the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Can you expand on that a bit, please?
Yeah, so the timing of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, by that I mean the first time the photograph emerged of Prince Andrew in, I think it was Central Park with Epstein. This was after Epstein had been convicted and released. So the timing of that photo emerging and the Arab Spring, both events happened quite close to each other. And so initially there was a bit of pushback against Prince Andrew having this role he was an official UK government trade envoy. And that formal position was taken away from him. But then for years and years after that, he continued to go out to these countries and effectively do the same thing, which again shows just how important he is to this relationship. These are personal relationships that he has with members of these royal families. And those are relationships that the arms companies want to maintain as a channel for promoting these arms sales.
You also found British involvement in the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Can you tell us about that?
So just to be clear, what we found was in the aftermath of the airstrike, that British soldiers were rushed to an airbase in Bahrain in the Gulf, which was expected to be a flashpoint if there was all-out war with Iran. So it was in the aftermath of the strike what we saw, rather than sort of, I don't know whether or not there was involvement in the planning of the strike. I can't speak to that, but what I can prove is that British soldiers were rushed out to the Gulf as soon as the strike had happened, because there was such a high chance of war, and that actually these military personnel were given some kind of commendation or award for having taken part in such a high stakes mobilization. So I think that just showed how close we came to war with Iran, which would have been completely catastrophic, to the extent that members of the British Armed Forces were given awards. for being able to mobilize so quickly. And again, that's something that should be known about. We've seen how disastrous the war was in Iraq. The idea of going and doing that in Iran is just unconscionable. But yeah, the danger of these war games just doesn't seem to get picked up on.
At the end of your documentary, Wharton's War on Yemen, you confront on camera the Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, and the Saudi ambassador at the arms fair, which recently took place in East London. Was this a pre-planned action? Was this something that you left your home with the intention of doing, or was it a more spontaneous act of real journalism?
Yeah, it was very spontaneous. So I'd gone to the arms fair with my colleague Matt Kennard, and we were mainly planning just to take still photos and short videos of the displays. We'd both been before, so we knew a little bit about what to expect. So we were tweeting out a lot of pictures of some of the weapons that were on sale there and things that have been used in Yemen and Palestine and other conflicts like that. And I think we'd sat down in a cafe for lunch, and then Matt saw Ben Wallace going around with a big entourage of Saudis. And so he said, go over there, because I had a camera on a smartphone on a selfie stick, which I've used before for doing kind of like video stuff. So I just started following them around, and it wasn't clear at first that it was the Saudi ambassador he was with. I think we only realized that afterwards when we looked back at the footage and saw his badge. But we knew it was a very high level Saudi delegation, and there were a lot of Air Force officers there. And then there were kind of journalists from like Saudi TV channels and Gulf TV channels, like state controlled channels. So it was kind of quite a tame media event. And then it got around to part of the display, and it just seemed like a good shot, and it looked like it was going to finish soon. So that's when I just started firing away questions about the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and the involvement of Mohammed bin Salman. So I didn't really know what would happen, didn't really have time to think it through. The camera's quite shaky because there was a Saudi Air Force officer trying to kind of elbow me out of the way. Ben Wallace, to his credit, after the second time I shouted out a question, he did come up with, a response of sorts. I mean, it's a very mealy mouth response, but it's quite honest in a way. Britain has had this relationship with the Saudis for decades and decades. It doesn't make it okay, but it is true. And then that was it. I think, it all happened very quickly, and then he went on his way. I think there was a cabinet reshuffle that day, so he had to get to Downing Street, and he was told he'd be reappointed as Defence Secretary. He'd done a good job defending the relationship with the Saudis. So he's still in post. And that was it, really. It all happened very quickly. We know that, ministers do often go to the arms fair, and that diplomats are there too, but, we were just lucky to see them both there together at that moment.
Were you surprised that more of this confrontation was not made in the mainstream media?
Yeah, I think it clearly had the potential to be a viral clip, and on our own channels it got a lot of attention, but as you say, it wasn't picked up by the BBC or by the national media. But that doesn't surprise me anymore, because we've been doing this for a number of years now, and we just see their attitude towards this kind of journalism. And I think, it was different in the past. There was a lot more investigative documentaries on television where this kind of journalism was very normal and very celebrated. And people, I think, still like it. We got a great response to that clip. But I think there's definitely a reluctance to show that kind of adversarial journalism. And, a few weeks later, my pass for the Conservative Party conference was revoked, and I haven't been given a justifiable reason for that. So I think people are afraid of losing access to things if they are too critical of government policy.
Yeah. Your stories have led to two different government probes. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so in 2014, I did a story about how the SAS had been involved in helping the Indian Army to plan a raid on the Sri Harmandir Sahib, which is the Golden Temple complex in Amritsar in India. It's the holiest site for the Sikh faith. And when the operation eventually went ahead, it was a complete bloodbath and a terrible massacre. And what I revealed was that in advance of that raid, the SAS had been sent out to India to advise on how to do an operation like that. So this triggered two government reviews. The first one into how involved the SAS had been. And the second one was into how I was even allowed to find the files in the first place, because the government's view was that they should never have been released. So, I mean, the eventual review was a whitewash, basically. I mean, they tried to downplay the SAS involvement and say that the plan the SAS came up with wasn't used. The Indian Army did their own thing and didn't listen to the SAS advice. But actually, I mean, it does look like elements of it were carried across. And yeah, it was just a review on the papers. No witnesses were called to give evidence in public or anything like that. So the Sikh community were very unhappy with it. And subsequent Labour manifestos have called for an independent inquiry. And the other review was by the chairman or former chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, Sir Alex Allen, into why the papers were allowed to be revealed at all. And that's part of just a wider pushback towards transparency. I feel like the pendulum is shifting now. There were a number of years where people were finding quite a lot from the National Archives, and some quite big revelations were coming out, you know, things like the torture in Kenya. And this led to like a lot of litigation, court settlements, and in the case of Northern Ireland, you know, attempts at like criminal prosecutions. And now we've got to the point where like that review was probably, you know, a bit of the start of it, saying, you know, papers to do with the SAS shouldn't be released, even if it's happened 30 years ago. To now where in Northern Ireland, they're saying like even like inquests about, you know, killings by the police or the army, like shouldn't, even an inquest shouldn't be allowed to go ahead, you know, because there's still families in Ireland who are waiting for inquests about how their families died during the Troubles. So it's, you know, and it's quite scary really to see where that could be going. And we've had the Overseas Operations Act as well, which has come out. So again, that makes it harder to bring civil or criminal litigation against the armed forces for abuses that have happened overseas. So they've done that for overseas operations. Now they're going to try and do that for things in Northern Ireland, and then probably, you know, the Human Rights Act itself is what they'll go for.
And also, Declassified was blacklisted at one point. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this led to another review. What happened was Ahmed al-Batati, the British soldier who we've mentioned, did his protest against the war in Yemen against British arms sales. And I called up the MOD press office. In my mind, it was quite a routine call. Just wanted their comment on his arrest because we'd seen videos on social media. And they said, yeah, sure, we'll get back to you. And then later they missed my deadline. And I said something like, you know, can you send me a comment? And they said, well, I'd seen that they'd given a comment to another journalist at the Telegraph, a defence correspondent at the Telegraph, who is a former British Army officer. So I called up the MOD press office and said, you know, you've given a comment to this guy, but why haven't you given one to me? And they said, my understanding is we no longer deal with your publication. So unfortunately, I was recording that call, so I had evidence of what had been said.
Unfortunately for them, not unfortunately for us.
Yeah. So then this led to a bit of a kind of mini outcry, and eventually the Council of Europe have like a media freedom alert system, and they issued a media freedom alert, and that then meant the government had to take it quite seriously, and they said, okay, we'll do a review, and we will get someone called Tom Kelly, who was Tony Blair's official spokesperson when he was Prime Minister, to do the review, which was quite amusing that they picked him. So that led to another review, but I mean, not much really changed. They said that, a serving military officer in the Ministry of Defence press office had made a decision, I think around July last year, that they'd no longer give comments to our website. So, but they wouldn't tell us, who that officer was or what unit they're from or, what they've been involved in. So there's still a lot more questions about actually what was going on. And yeah, there's still more things I'd like to know about, why they made that decision. But yeah, I think we had been publishing a series of stories, particularly about the war in Yemen and British arms sales to Gulf dictatorships like Oman. And I think that had, they were very sensitive because they're not used to that level of scrutiny on their relationships with those countries, and journalism that it's all factual, and we often link back to their own documents that we've got disclosed or parliamentary questions. So they can't kind of undermine it and say it's not true. And so then this was their kind of knee-jerk reaction, was just say, well, we're never going to talk to you again. But as a government department, they have a duty to treat all journalists equally, or at least give us all a response.
And what was the conclusion of that review?
Yeah, so the review, it just put in place, there's now some kind of scheme in the MOD press office where I think each month they have to show how they are still meeting these like civil service standards of, there's a civil service code about, kind of impartiality, because they don't want to be seen, the civil service itself shouldn't be overtly politicized. So that they had to adhere to those standards. But the head of the MOD press office, I think the day the review came out, it was also announced that he'd been moved to another department. So I think there was a bit of internal movement there. But the MOD press office is a fascinating organisation. You have people there serving military officers who are drafted in. You also have the former defence editor of The Sun, David Willits, is there. I think he's their deputy head of news. So you wonder why papers like The Sun and The Times get so many exclusive stories from the MOD, about certain operations they want reported. Well, it's because their former staff work there.
Yeah. Phil, you also revealed that Britain has 145 military sites / bases in about 42 countries. Can you tell us about that and how you came across this information?
Yeah, so the number will have gone down slightly since the
Afghanistan
evacuation from Afghanistan. Yeah, although they may have set up 1 or 2 bases elsewhere by now. That research was just done. Some of it was through freedom of information requests and questions in Parliament, but a lot of the information was kind of out there, but had never been kind of put together. And people talk, they say, we have a military base in the Falklands or in Cyprus, but it's when you actually say, well, where are those bases in Cyprus? It's okay. There are 2 bits of land, 3 bits of land on Cyprus that were never given back at the end of colonialism. They're still British colonies, but within those bits of land, you have farmers' fields, and then you'll have an airstrip, you'll have an oil depot, you'll have a military-run school. So, accommodation blocks, firing ranges. So when you start adding those all up, it's not just one military base. The number on Cyprus, I think we found dozens. Likewise on the Falklands, they have this huge compound at Mount Pleasant where everything's flown in, but then they also have a port somewhere else on the island. They have these surface-to-air missile outposts in other parts of the island. So, yeah, when you actually add up the bases in these places, that's how we got to the figure. And I modelled it on research that an academic had done in the US. I think his name is David Vine. He wrote a book called Base Nation, and he had a similar methodology of actually how many of these military sites are there in these places. And I think that's how he got his figure of it's over 1,000 US military bases around the world. So I tried to use his same method, and those were the results.
Where was the most surprising place that the UK military are stationed? And also in a situation where 1 in 10 soldiers in the British military are not UK citizens, where Britain has an overseas tax haven network, which is responsible for about 37% of all tax losses faced by governments around the world. To what extent can we say that Britain is a post-colonial nation?
Yeah, I think, the military itself has never decolonized. And if you look at how the military still has these bases in places like Nepal, where thousands of Gurkhas are recruited each year, to staff the British military. And then what's fascinating about the Gurkhas is a large number of them are then actually sent to Brunei, which is an enclave in the South China Sea, where the Sultan, he's an absolute dictator, and he has he relies on the Gurkhas effectively to keep him in power there. And those Gurkhas are also offered to the Singapore police, who have an armed police unit that the British Army effectively does the recruitment for in Nepal. So there are these kind of extraordinary colonial setups that have never ended, because they're essential for maintaining these kind of relationships of power that the UK has around the world. So I found some of those bases, in places like Nepal, Singapore, Brunei, that we don't really hear about. Quite fascinating, particularly with this, pivot towards China as well. I think a lot of those countries border or are very close to China as well. So the idea that Britain still has bases there, as well as the aircraft carrier being sent there, was quite surprising. But that where these bases are really concentrated is in the Gulf states, in oil producing countries. So in Saudi Arabia, we were able to map out quite a number of bases there, and things like British soldiers being embedded in the Saudi National Guard, and then being stationed in not just in the National Guard headquarters, but out in the Eastern Province as well, in Dhahran, which is a key oil producing city, and that's right next to the bridge that connects over to Bahrain, where again, there's British naval bases as well as British troops at a US air base in Bahrain. And then all these Gulf states. Oman, as we were writing that research, they were actively building more bases, so we were trying to keep up with that. And there was a British base in Oman that had only been mentioned once in a media report because a soldier had been involved in a sexual assault there. And so there was a report in a Portsmouth newspaper. He'd been taken back to Portsmouth and gone through a military court-martial there. But that was the only reference I could find to British troops being based at that airbase in Oman. So, it is extraordinary how hidden it is. And particularly when we hear as well, about Russia or China building military bases. Actually, in the case of China, they hardly have any overseas military bases. But even the ones, say the Russian bases in Syria, well, okay, but look at the British bases in Cyprus, just across the water from those bases. So, I think also there was a real missed opportunity after the Cold War to dismantle a lot of this overseas base network. And that didn't happen. And so now when Russia is kind of rearming or building bases, it's kind of, it's much harder to say that, if Britain didn't have all these overseas bases, then maybe, you'd have some moral high ground to say, well, Russia shouldn't build them or shouldn't want to keep them. But because we haven't done them in the last 30 years, it undermines the idea that, any argument against foreign military bases.
To what extent do you think post-World War II, you have the sort of Diego Garcia model of Britain evacuating and the US taking their place, obviously minus the sort of population transfer, which has happened with Diego Garcia. But also a lot of these bases will be likely to be shared. What's that kind of enmeshed relationship between British military presence and US military presence around the world? As we know here in this country, you have US military personnel stationed on bases which officially are just British military bases. But when you actually look into the reality of those bases, there's probably more US troops on some of them than British troops. So what could you tell us about that kind of relationship outside in the rest of the world?
Yeah, so I think, wherever there's a British military base abroad, the Americans are more than welcome to go there. and I think in Cyprus, US aircraft often use the runway there at RAF Akrotiri. So they're always welcome. And then you have cases, like you say, some of the bases in the Gulf, they might have a much bigger US presence, and then the UK will have kind of a block within that base. I think the base, El Udeida base in Qatar, I think is one example, where it's primarily US, but then, the RAF have a section there. And that is a way, as we've seen with the aircraft carrier that Britain has sent to the South China Sea, it costs so much just to afford the aircraft carrier that we can't afford enough planes to go on the runway. So the US Marine Corps have a contingent of jets on it, and then we can't afford enough escort ships to protect the carrier. So we're relying on US and other countries' naval ships to help protect the carrier. So I think that is, particularly since World War II and since the 70s, where the size of the British military has reduced, but then it's kind of this inflated sense of it still keeps these outposts, and we can't necessarily afford to staff them ourselves. So then we'll let the Americans in, or we'll buddy up with anyone else in the region to try and just do anything basically to make sure we never have to leave these places. Because that seems to be, the idea that Britain retreated from east of Suez in the 1970s. I mean, that never happened.
Right. It's well known that Cecil Rhodes once said that he wishes he could colonize space. He'd colonize space if he could. Much has been made of Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos and their ambitions to get into space. But far less, in fact, almost nothing has been written about the British military's plan to establish spaceports. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so there is this doctrine now in the Ministry of Defence that space is a war-fighting domain, which is quite extraordinary. And this seems to have developed over the last few years without anyone really, stopping to question what on earth that means. There was a bit of a kind of ridicule when Trump announced that he'd have this space force in the US, but that's carried on under Biden. You see Biden now doing appearances in front, there's a space force flag in the background often, and no one seems to think that's funny anymore. It's just become normal. And RAF personnel have been seconded to the US Space Force as well. So we're involved in it, and we are keen to have our own version of it to some extent. I mean, the RAF seem to be leading this kind of MOD space directorate, and there's about, I think, 6 or 7 spaceports around the UK, potential sites where satellites could be launched into space. Previously, we'd had to do this with the European Space Agency using a site in, I think, in Russia or Kazakhstan or somewhere like that. But now the idea is that in parts of, potentially down in Newquay, where there's a very long runway, where Richard Branson's Virgin Orbit plane, it's a Boeing aircraft that will take off, and then when it gets high enough, it shoots a satellite into space. Or they're sort of vertical rocket launch sites in northern parts of Scotland, or I think the Shetland Islands. I mean, this as well. I mean, there's an art gallery in the Highlands called Helmsdale, which has been trying to raise awareness about this issue. And there's kind of arms companies seem to be involved in a lot of these projects. The MOD have been having meetings with a lot of the companies involved. So even though they're being pitched as like civilian satellite communication projects at this stage, the military is already very interested. So you can see the direction that this is going to go in.
So space is the new cash cow. Could you also expand on Richard Branson's partner, Spaceport Cornwall, and their meetings with the MOD? Could you tell us what you know about that?
Yeah, so we know they've had a number of meetings, but we haven't been given any meeting minutes yet. I think I've asked for them, and it's just been months and months, and I haven't heard back. So I need to chase that up. But this down in Newquay, there is an RAF base there, and it has a very long runway that can be used for like emergency landings if transatlantic flights get into difficulties. And there's also a flying school, a helicopter academy at the airport that's run by an arms company. And it's only recently been shut down. But when I went down there, I found that Nigerian Air Force pilots were learning to fly helicopters there. And the RAF said they had no knowledge of it, even though it's right next to the RAF base. But the locals have been complaining a lot about the noise from the helicopters. So, you wonder how they're going to put up with, noise from kind of space takeoff flights and everything that goes with that. But the airport down there, it's got a domestic airport. You can fly from London to Newquay. So, but I think they've struggled with COVID to make any money from that. So they're looking now, people like Richard Branson's proposals are going to be more tempting for them. So yeah, there is potential that project will go ahead in some form.
Thanks a lot, Phil. And just before we go, it would be great for you to tell us a bit about your book, Keeny Meeny, The British Mercenaries Who Got Away with War Crimes.
Okay, thanks. That's kind of you. So my book, Keeny Meeny, exposes a group of British military veterans who set up a mercenary company called Keeny Meeny Services. The origin of the name is unclear, but we think it's a Swahili or potentially a Gulf Arabic phrase for undercover operations. And the company was involved in conflicts where the British government didn't want to be seen directly involved. So it played a very important role in the civil war in Sri Lanka, fighting against the Tamil Tigers, flying helicopter gunships and training elite commando units that were involved in lots of atrocities. It also served in Oman, and again, it was supporting a very repressive regime. The other thing it could do would be to help sabotage regimes which the West wanted to take down. So in Nicaragua, it helped to fight against the left-wing Sandinista government. And then in Afghanistan as well, it worked on the side of the Mujahideen against the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan. So yeah, this my book goes through declassified files to piece together the story of what the company did. And it's led to a war crimes investigation by the Metropolitan Police.
Wow. A lot. You've done a lot in a very short space of time also. Phil, thank you so much for giving us this interview. I hope that people check out your work. I hope they really give it the attention and respect that it deserves. And it would be great to talk to you again. Thanks so much for joining us.